Hello ma'am, good morning. My name is Demer Sigba from BSED English 2A. So in this video, I am going to answer the following questions in week 4 module. So what is genre? Genre is a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition that characterized by a particular style, form, or content. A classic of the Gothic novel genre. Number 2, what are the 5 major genres of children's literature? Explain each. So first, we have the picture books that are usually written for very young children who are learning to read. These books include thickly constructed word books for very young children, concept books such as those that teach the alphabet, counting, or basic reading skills, and simple illustrated books that are read to children to expose them to the language and the art of reading. The second one is traditional literature for children varies widely and is perhaps the most loosely defined genre because selection might overlap into the general fiction category. So number 3, we have the poetry and verse literature that includes the epic poem, narrative poem, dramatic poem, lyrics, and sonnet, among others. However, rhyming literature is popular with very young children as seen in the cherished nursery rhyme and fable favorites Mother Goose, Jack and Jill, and Little Miss Muffet. So number 4, we have the biographies and autobiographies for children that are usually meant to inspire young people or educate them while providing entertainment. And the last one is the fiction and non-fiction that comprise the widest variety of literature for children. Modern fantasy and science fiction stories have become extremely popular with children. Generally, modern fantasy is characterized by time travel, imaginary characters, and animals or inanimate objects that talk. Number 3, what is fantasy? So differentiate between high fantasy and low fantasy. Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction involving magical elements, typically set in a fictional universe and sometimes inspired by mythology and folklore. So, high and low fantasy are the two main categories of fantasy. High fantasy, refers to epic fantasy which is set in an alternate world. It typically includes lots of magical elements, fantastical creatures, and unusual technology, whereas low fantasy is when magical creatures and elements intrude upon the regular world. Number 4, what are the types of fantasy stories? Define each. So, there are 5 types of fantasy stories. First, we have the portal fantasy that refers to where characters travel from the real world into a fictional fantasy world, often through a portal or gateway. The second one is urban fantasy or contemporary fantasy. Urban fantasy can be tricky to define as it has been used in many different ways, often interchangeably with other fantasy subgenre terms such as low fantasy and paranormal fantasy. So, the third one is the fantasy romance. A fantasy romance is a high fantasy in which romance is a core element. Some people use the term to refer to any fantasy story with a romantic plot. And the next one is the children's fantasy. A children's fantasy, sometimes called juvenile fantasy, is one primarily aimed at children, usually with child protagonists. Sometimes novels are considered to be both YA fantasies and children's fantasies, particularly if they appeal to an age group that bridges late childhood and the early teenage years. And the next one is the heroic fantasy. Heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery are terms used to refer to high fantasy stories that focus primarily in swashbuckling heroes, swordplay, exciting battles, and violent conflicts. So number 5 is, what is science fiction? Explain. So fictions based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social or environmental changes. frequently portraying a space of time travel and life on other planets. So number 6, what is historical fiction? Explain. So historical fiction, it is a set in real place during culturally recognizable time. The details in the actions in the story can be a mix of actual events and ones from the author's imaginations as they fill in the gaps. Characters can be pure fiction or based on real people. Often, it's both. So number 7 is, what is realistic fiction? Explain. So realistic fictions creates imaginary characters and situations that depict our world and society. It focuses on themes of growing up and confronting personal and social problems. This genre portrays characters coming to understand themselves and others. So number 8, what are the types of realistic fictions? So realistic fiction is divided into two parts, historical and contemporary fictions. So historical fiction, it takes place in a time remote enough to be considered history rather than contemporary fiction, which takes place today or in the recent past. Number 9, what are picture books? So, picture books combines visual and verbal narratives in a book format, most often aimed at young children. With the narrative told primarily through text, they are distinct from comics, which those are primarily through sequential images. Number 10, what are the types of multicultural literature? Explain each. So multicultural literature includes books that portray people of color, like African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. So African American literature can be defined as writings by people of African descent living in the United States. It is highly varied African American literature. So number 2 is Native American literature. Reflects the culture, history, and contemporary issues of the people who are indigenous to what is now the United States. And number 3 is Asian American literature. Is the body of literature produced in the United States by writers of Asian descent. Asian American literature became a category during the 1970s, but didn't see a direct impact in viewership until later in the 1970s. Number 4 is Latino literature. It's literature written by people who of Latin American ancestry, often but not always in English, most notably by Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, and Dominican Americans, many of whom were born in the United States. Number 11, what are the samples of children's poetry books? Where the Sidewalk Ends, a children's garden of verses, revolting rhymes, falling up, a light in the attic, life doesn't frighten me, and one leaf rides the wind. And number 12, what are fables? So a fables is a story that features animals, plants, or forces of nature which are anthropomorphized, given human qualities. A fable always ends with a moral lessons. Number 13, what are myths? So myths are stories that are based on tradition. Some may have factual origins while others are completely fictional. However, myths are more than mere stories and they serve a more profound purpose in ancient and modern cultures. Number 14, what are legends? A legend is a genre of folklore that consists of a narrative featuring human actions, believed or perceived, both by teller or listeners to have taken place in human history. Number 15, what are told tales? A told tale is a story with unbelievable elements related as if it were true and factual. Number 16 is what are realistic tales? It is a genre consisting of stories that could have actual occurred to people or animals in believable settings. These stories resemble real life, and fictional characters within these stories react similarly to real people. Number 17, what are folk tales? Folk tales are stories in the oral traditions or tales that people tell each other out loud rather than stories in a written form. They're closely related to many storytelling traditions, including fables, myths, and fairy tales. Number 18. What are trickster tales? Trickster's Tale in oral traditions worldwide is a story featuring a protagonist who has magical powers and who is characterized as a compendium of opposites. Number 19, what are Noddlehead stories? Noddlehead tales are folk tales that involve a well-ended individual that often lacks common sense. At times, they may take words too literally, and their responses typically lead to very foolish actions. The humor is always gentle in nature, which makes the story enjoyable for all. Number 20, what are Mother Ghost stories? So Dan Leno created a poor woman who befriend a magical ghost that provides her with golden eggs. She is rich, but there is something she wants more than money. She wants to be young and beautiful. The pantomime has a strong moral, beauty, and wealth cannot bring you happiness.